Hello everyone. In this video, we are going to be doing an overview of AWS Parameter Store. I was recently trying to find the best practices for storing application configuration on AWS, and I came across Parameter Store and have been using it a lot, and I want to share some of my findings and thoughts on the service and just do a brief overview of all of the features. So in terms of the agenda for today's video, first we're going to talk about what is Parameter Store. We're going to talk about both storage and access. Then we're going to go into what it's like to use Parameter Store. We're going to talk about creating, updating, and accessing Parameter Store using the APIs. And I'll also talk a little bit about how Parameter Store compares to other AWS services that handle configuration management, like AWS AppConfig. And then once we're done that, I'm going to take you into the AWS console, and we're going to do a brief demo of creating a parameter and then accessing it using one of the APIs. So that is the agenda for today's video. So let's get into it. So first of all, what is AWS Parameter Store? And at the highest level, Parameter Store is a scalable and reliable configuration management solution that lets you store and access application configuration on AWS. And so back in the day, a lot of us that were building applications, we would simply include our application configuration alongside our deployment package. And then whenever our service started up, it would just read off that content and it was good to go. In modern times, applications are using things like feature flags, which require regularly checking certain configuration values that are stored externally so that we can kind of change the behavior of our application without having to do a deployment. And one of the decisions that goes into that is deciding where am I going to store these values that are going to determine how my application behaves. You may have a lot of requirements for this. You may want to have an audit trail, previous values, history, secure access, all that kind of stuff. These are the types of things that Parameter Store helps with. So at its center, Parameter Store is, of course, a configuration management solution. And the building block that you're going to be using with Parameter Store are, no shocker, parameters. And parameters are just key value pairs. You create a parameter with a name, and then you can assign it a text value that you can retrieve later on. So there's two main kind of buckets for Parameter Store. There is storing your value, and then of course there is accessing your value. Both of these two things are important. You want to store your configuration securely. You want it to be reliable and replicated all across AWS so that the values cannot be lost. And in terms of access, you want reliable availability, predictable latency, all those types of things as well. And of course, Parameter Store sits on top of AWS's global infrastructure. So by default, you get automatic data replication between multiple availability zones. You have different regions that could potentially host your configuration. You are piggybacking on top of some of the most advanced global infrastructure that cloud services have to offer today. So that's a little bit about what Parameter Store is. Let's go a little bit deeper now into that storage layer and talk about how you use it and how Parameter Store kind of keeps track of your values. So the message that I wanted to give with this slide here is that Parameter Store is a versatile and configurable configuration management solution. And you have multiple different options in terms of how you store your data. So some simple concepts first. Parameters have three different types. They can be strings, string lists, or secure strings. And when you're creating your parameter, you can do so in either plain text or you can use structured text, so things like JSON or XML. One thing to keep in mind, though, is that the text field in Parameter Store is freeform, and there's no validation of any of the types. So for example, if you're using JSON and you accidentally put in a JSON string that maybe has an extra comma or something like that, there is no validation that Parameter Store does on the values that you put within it. So that is really up to you as the user. Not a big deal, but just something you should be aware of. Now, in terms of secure strings, you can store your values securely within Parameter Store so that no other users can see them. And on top of that, you can encrypt your values with KMS or Keymaster service. And you can either use a AWS provided KMS key or you can create your own. Keep in mind, if you create your own, there are additional costs with doing that. So just be aware of it. Now, another neat feature of using this service is that you get access to the history of your values. So as you change the values of your configuration over time, you'll be able to see all of that stuff directly in the AWS console. So you can see who changed your values, when they changed it, what the previous values were, so on and so forth. Very useful for keeping an audit trail. Now, there are two different tiers of parameters that you can choose from when you are creating your parameter. The first one is standard, and the second one is advanced. So let's talk about standard first. So with the standard tier, you have a 4 kilobyte max size for every entry that you put into parameter store. And you are not able to use parameter policies. Parameter policies are a feature that allows you to do things like expire a value of a parameter at a certain period of time or a relative time, so 20 days from now or 30 days from now, so on and so forth. In addition, standard parameters are also free to use unless you opt in to the higher throughput option, in which case you will pay, I believe it's 5 cents per 10,000 API requests. However, there are no other charges for using parameter store. Now, the advanced tier is, more advanced, so it offers a little bit more features. So it is 8 kilobytes max size, so double of the standard. And in addition, it can use those parameter policies to expire values at certain periods of time. You also have access to higher throughput with the advanced tier as well. But one caveat of all this is that charges do apply. There's a flat value for the number of parameters that you have per month, which is 5 cents. And there are additional charges for using the getParameter API. Now, one thing to keep in mind when you're deciding between one over the other is that if you choose to go with standard and you change your mind to go with advanced later on, that's totally fine. That is allowed. You can easily upgrade from standard to advanced directly in the console or through the CLI or however you want. However, you cannot go from advanced to standard. The reason being is that with advanced, you have an 8 kilobyte max size. With standard, you have a 4 kilobyte. And in order to downgrade, AWS would need to kind of chop your value in half, I suppose. And they don't want to offer that as a feature. So you cannot downgrade from advanced to standard. Now, one other small thing that I wanted to bring up is that there is something called an intelligent tier, which can change between these different tiers automatically, depending on your usage. That may be something that you're interested in, but typically I think people just choose either one or the other. All right, so that's it for storage. At this point, I want to talk about how to use parameter store or what it takes to use it. And what I wanted to summarize this slide with was that parameter store supports both scalable and secure access that's easy to use, and it's an intuitive service in general. So in terms of the flow of using parameter store, first, obviously, you need to create your parameter. Once you have it stored in parameter store, then it's all about accessing your parameter. And you have two main options of accessing the values within your parameter. The first is using the vanilla getParameter API. Very straightforward and easy to use. Here's an example of me using it. You can see in the first line, we're just using Boto3. The second line, we're instantiating a client of Systems Manager, which is kind of the umbrella service that parameter store sits under. And then on the third line, we're using that client to call the getParameter API. We are providing the name of our parameter, which is super secret string in this case. And then we are providing a optional field here with decryption, and we are saying that is true. Now, if you're using a secure string and you want to have access to the raw value, the unencrypted value, you need to say with decryption is equal to true. If you want access to the encrypted value, you can say with decryption is equal to false. So the latter would allow you to handle the parameter without necessarily having access to the plain text version of it. And if you're using the getParameter API, then of course you need the IAM access to the getParameter API as well. So make sure that you have those things if you try to use it. So in other words, parameters that you put inside parameter store are guarded by IAM, and you can craft policies that guard access to certain parameters or just grant access to certain parameters as well using IAM. Some details in terms of throughput. The default limit is 40 transactions per second. However, this is upgradable. You can go up to 3,000 transactions per second according to the documentation. So if you have some very chatty applications, parameter store will have no problem handling that. And I suspect that they can actually raise this limit even more. You may need to file a support ticket in order to get that done. So one of the issues with using parameter store is that after you made the call to retrieve the value of your parameter, someone can change the value in the AWS console, and your application won't get any information about that change. It won't know that the configuration value changed, and it may be operating with a certain application behavior that is now out of date. In other words, your parameters can get stale immediately after reading them because someone can just come and change the value without you really knowing about it. So a lot of developers handle this in either one of two ways, actually. The first way is you set up some kind of background process that will automatically kind of retrieve the parameter from parameter store. It'll cache it for a short period of time. When it expires, it'll automatically go grab the most recent value, put it back in the cache, and then your application basically always has access to the most updated value with a little bit of delay. But you can set this delay to really low if you want to. So this approach will make sure that you're always having the most fresh value. The other option is to introduce it into the flow within your API itself. So say you have an API and maybe you want to use a feature flag, and the value of the feature flag will change what your application does. You can make a call to parameter store every time with your API. However, that's going to introduce additional latency. It's going to introduce another failure point. There's a whole bunch of problems that introduces, so you don't really want to go with that. The first option is much more preferred. Now, to make that first option a little bit more palpable, if you're using a service like AWS Lambda, you can use Lambda and parameter store extensions. And extensions are simple configuration that you attach to your Lambda function, and it makes it such that whenever your Lambda function starts up, there's a background process that automatically starts up with it that does that automatic retrieval, automatic synchronization, and periodic checking of your value over time. And anytime you try to retrieve your parameter from parameter store, it'll use the value that's stored in the cache. And this extension just makes it a whole lot easier to use parameter store, and it makes it much more efficient for you as the user as well. So if you're using something like AWS Lambda, highly recommend you to check out the extensions that are available for it. Other than that, you can use the get parameter API directly. And if you need access to kind of an up-to-date value constantly, you can write a simple little background job that periodically pulls parameter store for updated values over time. All right, so that's a little bit about what parameter store offers in terms of accessing it. I did want to briefly talk about AppConfig, because AWS AppConfig is another configuration management service also under the umbrella of Systems Manager. And a lot of us, especially me, got really confused when trying to decide, like, where should I store my configuration? These two things seem really alike, and it's not really clear what the difference is or when you should use one over the other. So what I wanted to do now is just give you kind of the TLDR of what the difference is between these two services. So AppConfig is, like I said, another configuration management solution, but AppConfig offers deployment bells and whistles. It's not just about configuration management, it's about safe deployments of your configuration. So you can introduce your configuration slowly over time. You can integrate with Amazon CloudWatch with AppConfig so that if there's any errors in your application, you can automatically roll that configuration back. You can manually roll back to a previous version of your application configuration as well. This in contrast with parameter store. Parameter store is kind of like the Wild West. It's just kind of a text field value that you store, and there's no real other assistance other than that. In addition, AppConfig supports something that I think is really important, which is schema validation. So if you haven't been burned by bad schema or bad input in a configuration, then count yourself lucky. It's happened to me. So the problem that AppConfig addresses here is that it's very easy to accidentally, put in an incorrect value in your configuration, or maybe just a syntax error, like have 2 commas in a JSON object, for example. AppConfig offers schema validation, so you can write a JSON file that basically specifies what are the required keys, what are the types of those keys, and different kind of constraints that you can apply on a key level. So this will ensure that any configuration that you put in AppConfig will be guaranteed to be validated, so you can't accidentally introduce incorrect versions into your application. So those are kind of, in my opinion, the 2 main benefits of using AppConfig. If you contrast that in general with parameter store is just a simple configuration storage that allows you to store keys and values. That's all it is. There's no bells and whistles. It's just kind of plain text, do what you want. So I hope this kind of helped for people that are trying to understand the difference between these two services. So at this point, I want to take you into the AWS console, and I want to show you how to use parameter store to access values from a Lambda function. So let's go over and do that now. All right, everyone. So here we are in the AWS console. To access parameter store, you have to go to the Systems Manager section of AWS. So it's not in the parameter store section. Systems Manager is the umbrella service that holds it. So you're going to either want to click it if it's under your recently visited, or just type it up in the search box here. So let's click on Systems Manager here and check out what's going on. So as you can see, Systems Manager has a whole bunch of services or a whole bunch of features that it offers. For our case, we'll want to go under the Application Management section and then click on Parameter Store. And once you do that, this is the Parameter Store homepage. So you can see here, I do already have a parameter. We can of course create a parameter over here, which will launch the wizard. And you can do things like look at some of the public parameters. There are quite a few that are useful for different AWS services and different integrations with other third-party providers. So for example, I don't know, let's go to ECS. We can see some of the configurations that they offer that you can access today. So this is an AMI version. You can come in here. This is the value that they're storing. So you can see it is a JSON object. So there are a bunch of public parameters that are stored within Parameter Store that you can access. We're not going to be using that feature, but it's just something to know about. In addition to that, you also have the settings option here. And so you have an option of rejigging your parameter store throughput. So as you can see, parameter store throughput is set to use the paid tier higher throughput limit. That is kind of what I opted in to use. The parameter store throughput setting applies to the current AWS account and region, which means it applies to all AWS IAM users in the account. You can of course reset this limit. Actually, let's just do this to see what happens here. So this is going to return us back to the default limit. So if you require additional throughput for your parameters, then you're going to want to come here and raise the limit here. If not, then you can just use the default. And then the second section here, the parameter store default tier, this just defines what the default tier is when you create your parameter. Anyways, let's go and close that out. Let's go back to my parameters and let's create two parameters, and I'll show you what it looks like in the wizard. So we're going to go to create parameter over here. You can give this a name. We're just going to use this one for a normal string. So I'm literally going to name this normal string. And then you can select the different tier. Of course, there's the standard and the advanced. The standard, you're limited to 10,000. There's 4 kilobytes and no policies are available. There's no additional charge for using them. With advanced, you can do 8 kilobytes. Parameter policies are available and charges do apply for using them. Then you need to decide, do you want to use a string list, or a secure string? We're going to use just a normal string here. The data type is text. The other option is EC2 image, which isn't relevant for us. So you can just put in your string here. And that's all you really need to do for a basic string. So let's go and click on create parameter now. And you can see we have normal string here. Let's go ahead and change this value to something else so I can show you what the history feature looks like. So we'll change the value to 2 here and go to save changes. And then when you go into it now, you'll see the version is now 2. You can see the value is your string 2. And if you go into the history section up over here, you can see the previous version. So currently it is version number 2 with your string 2. In the past, it was version 1 with just your string. And then it's got the last modified date and the user that did so as well. So very good from an audit trail perspective. So that's how it works for just a normal string. Let me show you what it looks like for a secure string now. So going back here, let's create a parameter. We're going to call this the super secret string. And let's do advanced just to show you some of the additional options that you have available. And then we're going to set it to be secure string. And now it's asking us for the KMS key. KMS is Keymaster Service. It's an encryption service. You can either select a key that is within your current account, or maybe you want to use one from another AWS account. So for your current account, by default, it's just going to pick the AWS provided key, which is the AWS SSM KMS key in this case. But you can create your own KMS keys if you wish. And if you do, it'll be available for you to choose from here. There's a whole bunch of reasons why you may want to do that, but that's kind of beyond the scope of this video. All right, so in terms of the value, we are going to call this, the super secret string, I think I said, right? Super secret string, that's what I said at the top, right? Or secret super string, super secret string, perfect. All right, you can see it's already trying to protect this value here by graying it out for us, cool. Now this is the parameter policy that you have access to when you're using the advanced version of Parameter Store. So you can either use no expiration policy, so the parameter is permanent. You can use absolute time, so it's going to say like when do you want to schedule this in to expire on a certain day and a certain hour and minute. or you can say relative time. So you can say like 6 hours from now, all that kind of stuff. And then in addition, you can add a policy, a notification policy. And like you can see here, you can create notification policies to send notifications from CloudWatch events for whenever the parameter expires or if the parameter is not changed for a given period of time. So if you want to have alarms on this or have metrics so that you can detect changes over time, then you can choose to add a certain policy to it. Let's just leave this as no expiration policy because it makes things a bit more complicated. Now we are going to go ahead and click on create parameter. And you can see we do have an advanced parameter here, and we have two different parameter store parameters. We have one under normal string, and we have one under super secret string. So now let's go and check out our Lambda function where we're going to be accessing these two different parameters from. So I'm going to go to the Lambda section of the AWS console. I'm just going to type in Lambda here. And I have a function that I already created. It's this one here, parameter store demo. And I took the liberty of assigning a IAM policy to this function that we need, but let me show you what that looks like. I'm going to go into configuration and under permissions on the left-hand side here. And so if you go to the action section here, actually you can see we have AWS System Manager. And if you go to the action tab here, you can see we have the SSM get parameter action as well. That is going to allow us to access all resources under parameter store. So let's write some simple code here just to test this out. So we're going to go to code. Now, before we do that, I just wanted to point out that we are not going to be using the Lambda and parameter store extensions for this demonstration. We are simply going to be using the vanilla get parameter API. If you want to use that extension, I'm going to leave a link in the description section below for how you can do that. It just requires one extra step to add the extension and the code looks completely different. So I'll leave that in the description section and you can check it out. And we're going to import some things. We're just going to say import boto3. Now we need to create our client. So client is equal to boto3.client, and you need to put in quotes SSM here for systems manager. And then within your Lambda handler or however else you are using this, you're going to put response is equal to client.get underscore parameter. Then you need to put a name in. So name is equal to whatever the name of your parameter is within parameter store. And then there's also this with decryption. You can either set this to true or false. If you're using just a normal string and not a secure string, this is ignored and it doesn't matter. However, if you're using a secure string and you set this to false, you're going to get the encrypted string back, not the real string that you're stored in parameter store. And if you set this to true with a secure string, you're going to get the value that you stored within it. So just keep that in mind as well. You're going to get the plain text value back if you set this to true. And let's just print the response now so we can see what's going on. And so let's do that. So we're going to deploy this now and let that deploy. And this looks good. We're going to test this out. You can see here under the parameter key, there's a parameter with a name called normal string and then a value called your string too. So to access it, you would just look at the response parameters key, and then within the name normal string, you're going to look at the value, which is your string too. So let's test this out now with the super secret string. And let's do this with decryption equals to false and then decryption equals to true so you can see what the difference is. So let's go to deploy really quick. So that has now been changed, and let's click on test. And you can see what we have here. So the value, so we have the super secret string and the value is this encrypted value that we have here. Let's change this up really quick. Let's set the with decryption is equal to true. And now if you click on deploy again, we should see the plain text version of that. And let's see if we do. And there you go. Super secret string is the value. So I hope this video was useful for you. If you want to learn more about feature flags, check out this other video on the right. And thanks so much for watching. I'll see you next time.